Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Today's conversation features André De Shields. If the timing of this episode were different, I probably would have simply described him as an actor, singer, dancer, and long-seasoned fixture on Broadway. However, the day before we were scheduled to do our interview, André's photo appeared on the front page of the New York Times Arts section, above the fold no less, because of his participation in an event at Carnegie Hall called Black Stars of the Great White Way. Stephen Holden, writing for The Times, referred to De Shields as a cheeky, outspoken, latter-day vaudevillian. And that opened up a whole range of questions for me to start our conversation, our interview, by talking to André about. Raised in Baltimore in the 1940s and 50s, De Shields attended college in Ohio, briefly in Denmark, and then in Wisconsin, and then spent a bit of time in Chicago before eventually settling in New York City in the early 1970s. Not long after arriving in New York, he was cast in the title role of The Wiz on Broadway, which was a defining moment in his career. And some subsequent Broadway shows include Ain't Misbehavin' and The Full Monty, as well as countless regional theater, television, and film credits. But you know, it's a funny thing. I've noticed when I do these introductions, the more established one of my guests is in their career, the less I feel the need to introduce them. The case of André is certainly no exception. His curriculum is as long as they come, and he seems to be constantly working. He's received all kinds of awards and accolades. But our conversation was so compelling, and he's such a force of nature that I'm a little bit at a loss for how to preface this. So I'll give you my personal experience and context. André attended the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the 1960s, where he met my parents and my aunt, and they all remained friendly over the years. I first remember meeting him when he came back to Madison to perform in a play when I was in high school. And then sometime later, he came back again to perform, and I backed him up on the drums that time. That was about 10 years ago, maybe a little more. Then several years ago, we kind of reconnected in New York to work on an autobiographical project that he's developing called PIMP, or sometimes called the Goatman Project. Over the course of about a year, we spent the occasional afternoon writing, recording, and talking about music and his life and life in general. Then those sessions were, for me, always a joy, extremely informative, and a kind of a graduate course in what I'm not sure. But in our interview, it's very clear to me that context is deeply important to André. He's constantly framing his experience in the larger historical, cultural, and sometimes universal context. This episode is among the longest that I've done, but I can't find anything I want to cut. So I'm leaving it in your capable hands and ears, and I hope that you find it as compelling as I do. Before we get started with the conversation, here's an excerpt from the music that we did together in 2012. This is André's piece, Baltimore.
Give me a beat. Yeah, boy. Show up a boy. Pizza. 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 This is Baltimore. Trying to grow up, people shoot you down. What can a midnight boy do in a 9 o'clock town like Baltimore? Welfare's your only insurance. Crime's your only friend. Life expectancy is a joke. You're finished before you begin in Baltimore. Two parents, 10 siblings, crumb snatchers everywhere. Lucky number 9 knows better. He's getting the hell out of here. Escape! Baltimore. Living in the ghetto, working on the hill, pimping down the avenue, looking for that found in Baltimore. Brother against brother, day against night, nigga against negro, crack against white. Believe in Baltimore. Come on, cat, hit me. Yeah, Baltimore is separate and unequal. Brown versus the board. Atavism rules the culture, and even the good Lord forgot Baltimore. Toe of the North, head of the South, rump of the nation with a Confederate mouth. Hello, Baltimore. Federalist architecture, white marble stoops, pork barrel politicians. Hey, hey, here we go, loop-de-loop. Come on, here we go, loop-de-loop. Here we go, loop-de-loop. 695. Here we go, loop-de-loop. 695. Here we go, loop-de-loop.
Let's hit it. 5, 6, 7, 8.
André De Shields, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
We originally had planned to do this a few weeks ago, and at the time I was concerned that, time might get away from us and it wouldn't happen. But as it turned out, I think it was really fortuitous that we rescheduled, because not even 48 hours ago I woke up to see your face on the front page of the arts section of the New York Times.
4 columns wide and above the fold. It doesn't get any better than that.
And I thought, well, this is a little message that the timing is right for this.
It's right, yeah. I've been such a rock star for 2 days now. Well, Facebook is on fire, right? Twitter is on fire. My telephone won't stop ringing, and that's okay. But I've been in this industry long enough to know that that isn't what I want to happen on a daily basis. Because I got things to do, really.
And the show 2 days ago was celebrating Black contribution to Broadway?
The title of the concert was Black Stars of the Great White Way. And the subject was Live the Dream. And the reference to I Have a Dream is intended. The scope of the piece is massive. I mean, the vision is really comprehensive and takes in the African diaspora. It was a 3-hour experience at Carnegie Hall. We could have gone on for 7 hours and not finished.
Sure.
But the union say, hey, it's 11 o'clock. You don't have to go home, but you got to get out of here. But at the same time, it was a family reunion in exactly the way the O.J. sang about it. Family reunion. It's a family reunion. TSOP, the sound of Philadelphia, folks. At any rate, so these were individuals from across the nation, from all the big cities and many of the small cities, everyone having one thing in common, and that is to share in the American dream by finding one's success in the performing arts. I flew back from San Diego on the red eye on Sunday so I could be at my rehearsal 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, because the show was 8 o'clock Monday evening. Everyone else had been rehearsing during that week. Now, before I left, I had spent time with the musical director, the conductor, and the stage director, so that the idea was when Andre returned, we would just plug him in. And it turns out that the plug worked absolutely. AC, DC, polarized, the whole thing.
Clearly, because they focused on you, they led with you. And the thing I noticed about the New York Times piece was it was brief. It was only a paragraph about you. But as I looked at that paragraph, I thought, there's a lot of information here. One thing is, I forget exactly how they refer to you, but the essential message is you're a triple threat, because you sing, dance, and act. I think they called you a vaudevillian.
Let me tell you what Stephen Holden wrote. Cheeky, outspoken, latter-day vaudevillian. I said, I'll take that.
It's a short sentence, but each of those words has tremendous weight, and I looked at that and I thought, that sounds about right.
And this is the result, whether the person who hears us agrees or not. But this is the result of being the author of your own story. Mm-hmm. Then you, the individual, is not surprised with how he is described by the objective perspective. We know we can't be loved by everybody all the time. But when those are in the seat of power to dictate to the rest of the literate world how to think about an individual, and I'm talking about critics, it's nice that they can succinctly encapsulate you in a description to which you do not object.
Because you've set the terms.
Exactly.
I think we got to go back. I was thinking about our time together last year and the year before when we were working on your project.
Yes.
And I learned a lot about you in that period because so much of it is autobiographical.
Right.
But I also realized as I was thinking back over it that it just revealed to me how much I don't know. There's such a rich history, and I'm so curious, even though I spent all that time with you and learned about your childhood, I thought, man, I feel like I really don't know anything. But let's talk about it.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say this. Socrates said, when you realize that you know nothing, then you have become wise.
Then I'm on my way. Because
yes, you are. Yeah, you're a wise young man.
So you grew up in Baltimore.
Yes, I did. I was not born in Baltimore. I was born in Dundalk, which is now a suburb of Baltimore, but at the time I was born in 1946, it was a shanty town. And Baltimore was ruled by Bethlehem Steel. Of course, since then, Baltimore has resuscitated itself from the bust of the steel industry. And now it's sort of the Silicon Valley of the mid-Atlantic. It's a conference city. We have resuscitated the Chesapeake Bay, so the shellfish are back and that kind of thing. But when I grew up in Baltimore, it was on the slippery side of the slope.
What did your father do? What did your parents do?
When I was old enough to have one-on-one conversations with my parents, I learned from my mother that her dream was to be a dancer. Now, her parents, who were not even 50 years from the Emancipation Proclamation, said to her, "You're not going to shuffle your way through life. That is not the profession for a decent young colored woman." Similar story with my dad. He shared with me that he wanted to sing. His parents said to him, "How are you going to be a good husband and a responsible father with a career as a singer? There's nothing there but insecurity." My parents deferred their dreams to be performers. But that, although the dream is deferred, that energy doesn't go away. So what happens to it? It resulted in 11 children. But somewhere along the line, that deferred chromosome X, that deferred chromosome Y, had to come together in some moment of conception and pass that mantle on to one of the children. So I consider myself lucky number 9. I am the manifestation of my parents' deferred dreams. There was never a conscious thought that I had that wasn't about becoming not only an entertainer, not only a performing artist, but an unparalleled star.
Was there music in the house? Was there dancing in the house?
Yeah, my mother would dance around the house. My father would sing around the house. My 10 siblings all fancied themselves singers because we were listening to the radio, and we're talking about doo-wop. We're talking about blues and the transition into rhythm and blues, into rock and roll, jazz, that sort of thing. Having parents and 10 siblings, you have an intergenerational experience, sort of your own United Nations. So while my mother and my father were listening to Louis Armstrong and the Ink Spots, for instance, Bill Kenny and the Ink Spots, my older brothers were listening to Sonny Till and the Orioles, which was one of the greatest groups from Baltimore, and Pookie Hudson and the Spaniels, which was the first group that put Gary, Indiana on the map.
Pre-Jackson.
Yeah, not Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5. That's my older brothers. Of course, my older sisters were listening to the crooners, Jackie Wilson, Johnny Ray even, whom we know is a white guy, but he sang with such soul that we had him in the household. And then there was the middle group that I fell into, and we were coming to life to Motown. And then there were the two youngest, one boy younger than I and one girl younger than I, and they were just reaching into the Beatles and white rock and roll, much of which is sourced in black rhythm and blues.
Sure.
So there was this comprehensive spectrum of music in the house. Now, I come from the old school, which there was a time when if you were a black American, you could sing and you could dance, not because you studied, but because it was in your DNA. Nowadays, it isn't cool to sing and dance simply because you're black. You have to have gone to some sort of conservatory and trained formally. I'm not saying it was easy for me to transition into becoming a professional performer, because it was not easy. But what was always without question is that would be my destiny.
Mm-hmm. You obviously had a predisposition to performing and to entertaining. And then you also had a kind of a built-in audience in the house because there were so many people around you. Did you feel that that was your first audience?
Yes. My first audience were members of my family, enlarged by the people in the neighborhood. Again, you know about my sister Iris already, who was one of my heroes as I was growing up, who taught me how to dance. I was her partner, and we would literally earn extra pennies because when the older folks would have parties, it was always, Andre, Iris, do that new dance. And we'd get together and we'd dance, and they'd give us a few pennies, and that was the way we honed our craft.
Mm-hmm. So it was a supportive community at that time of people that encouraged you to do it.
It was a supportive community of blue-collar workers. As I mentioned before, Bethlehem Steel was the major employer in Baltimore, and all of the men in the hood worked at Bethlehem Steel before and after serving in the armed forces.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting that you make a note of how things have changed, where you didn't have to go to a conservatory or a special school to be taken seriously as an entertainer, be able to make that transition.
Right.
But you also mentioned something that kind of jumped out at me, which is that there was a real awareness in the house of what was your music, what was black music, and what was white music. And you sat up and paid attention when there was a white artist who came in, who was played on the radio in your house, because it sounds like it was a little bit unusual. A little bit unusual, but also tremendously informative, because the white artists came into our homes because they were covering black hits. Mm-hmm. Now, at the time that I was growing up, although we didn't use the term race music, we didn't use the term, but in the culture, there was still this invisible line of demarcation. Songs by black performers could be hits on the black radio or the black charts. But if you wanted to be a crossover artist, Pat Boone had to cover the song. Mm-hmm. Patti Page had to cover the song. Johnny Ray had to cover the song. Then once the white demographic liked the song, it was just a matter of time when we realized that we were all listening to the same music, and that if we wanted to groove to the music, the first thing we had to overcome was this insane sovereignty, this delusion about you're white, I'm black, and never the twain shall meet. We love the music. We got to come together, regardless of where we come from politically, racially, nationally, ethnically, sexually. We love the music. We want to groove together. Were you able to get to that point while you were still in Baltimore, or was that something in hindsight that you were able to see? I was able to get to that point in Baltimore because I was aware of the walls, not only that were being built by the dominant society to keep me in Baltimore,
but the walls of defense that I was building to protect myself from what we consider the oppressor. As my mind opened and as my heart opened, I realized for a large portion of my young life, and I don't say this tongue-in-cheek, not only was white might, it was also right. So at my earliest opportunity, I left the historically black public education system. And by the time I was going to high school, I was in a college preparatory school which was predominantly white and majorly Jewish. And that was my launching pad, not only to get over and beyond those walls that I was telling you, those invisible walls that were keeping me locked in the hood experience, but it also created some lifetime relationships that have benefited me into the 21st century.
How did you find that school? What were you looking for? How did that happen?
I was looking for a step up. We all knew about Baltimore City College. It still is one of the better high schools in the United States of America. But because we believed in the brainwashing that we were being sold, you have to understand that my formative years were prior to the Brown versus the Board of Education. And then my pubescent years were right after that. So when I finished high school in Baltimore, the park that's comparable to Central Park in Baltimore is called Druid Hill Park. As a matter of fact, the rap group called Druid Hill is named after that park. Cisco, the blonde black guy. Yeah, from Druid Hill. But the point I'm making is simply is that when I left Baltimore, graduating from high school in 1964 to go to college, the first in the family, that sort of thing, setting all kinds of precedents, there was still a colored swimming pool in that park. There was a white swimming pool. There was a colored swimming pool. A couple of seasons ago, there was a Broadway hit musical called Hairspray, right? Fashioned after John Waters' film Hairspray. Waters is also from Baltimore. So when Hairspray did its national tour, and I had friends in the company, it went to Baltimore to play the Hippodrome Theater. I returned home briefly to take members of my family to see the show. And when I visited backstage after the show, I asked the company to please give me a few minutes of their time. It was between the matinee and the evening performance. I said, I know you have to get your dinner, get back to the show, but I want to share something with you because the entertainment that you are doing is history making in a sense, because the theater you're working in, the Hippodrome, I could not attend when I grew up in Baltimore. John Waters could, but I couldn't. And I even auditioned for the television dance show that you are parodying in this show. It's the Corny Collins show in Hairspray. It was the Buddy Dean show in Baltimore. And I used to watch it on black and white, a small screen black and white television. And because I could sing and I could dance, I wanted to be on the show and dance to the music that the white teenagers were dancing to, which was recorded by all the black performers. And the day that I went to audition, it was totally pleasant, right? Everybody was sweet, but it was an unwritten law. I would not appear on that show. This was in the late 50s. So many decades later, here my history stares me in the face. It has changed. We've made progress.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of information and these are the kinds of experiences that continue to feed me as a performing artist, that keeps me hopeful and optimistic about the changes that we can make through art.
That's wonderful, and it really is unusual to hear people tell you firsthand about the transformative power of art, not only the work itself, but the people who do the work and the way they do it. And I was thinking about you a little bit before you came over and thinking about how many historical moments, just by virtue of coming up when you did and seeing history at the times that you saw it, that you were on the forefront of certain things. This is a great example of that, how you're talking about coming up in Baltimore at a time when it's not integrated, but it's moving away from a very segregated past and towards the inevitable future, but it hasn't arrived.
It hasn't arrived. And just as my mother would say, someday there's going to be, we didn't have the term African American at the time, but someday there's going to be a Negro president of the United States. I just hope I'm around to see it. Well, my mother died in 1990. So when Barack Obama came along, the entire family went, she was prophetic. We wish she could be here to see this. It is really a testament to the strength and the resilience of the United States of America that we can make this kind of progress. I know we have political issues all the time, but we're not dropping bombs in each other's neighborhoods. So pluralism, the participation in a democratic government by the majority of the people, has succeeded in this country, and it continues to grow, and that I've been around long enough to experience its happening, I find terribly fulfilling, totally amazing, and makes me want to live forever, because I now have a taste of how far we have yet to go and how much we can achieve if more people come to their right mind, if you will.
I will. What were the images of black entertainers that you saw outside of Baltimore and even maybe outside of the popular music? Like, did you see any images of black entertainers who were already thriving in the more quote-unquote mainstream or white world?
Oh, yes. I say this affectionately. There was a time when the successful black performer did everything by instinct. He did not train as much as he absorbed from his culture or graduated from the school of hard knocks. Probably the most egregious example, because this is the individual that most people know, will be Sammy Davis Jr. When I was growing up, I want to be like Sammy Davis Jr. This was a man who seemed that he could do everything. He could dance, he could sing, he could appear on television variety shows. He could make movies with Frank Sinatra. You know, he was the only black member of the Rat Pack, that kind of thing. So that was the ideal at the time. Then, decades later, comes along Denzel Washington. So I affectionately say BD and AD, before Denzel and after Denzel.
Really? Because
Denzel isn't the only and isn't the first, but in terms of being the chosen, he is the one who exploded onto film, even in a greater sense than Sidney Poitier did. Sidney Poitier didn't as much explode as he worked hard and arrived and set the precedent. But one day, it seemed, Denzel Washington was doing off-Broadway theater in New York, and the next day, he was doing X.
You know, the other interesting thing I never thought about before is that he was a viable sex symbol to all women.
All women, regardless of color. Exactly, regardless of color. As a matter of fact, you'd be hard-pressed to name a film in which Denzel Washington stars and his female co-star is black. More often than not, she's white. I don't hold that against him. I'm just saying this is, again, about crossover success. So I'm trying to answer the question you asked. So before Denzel, it was grab what you can, be king of the mountain as long as you can, until the next person came along who had grabbed a little more than you did and knocked you off. Denzel is the representative of those who studied. He's learned to succeed through diligent compromise. And now he prevails, not only in film, but now he comes back to the stage when he wants. And that is what everybody admires, to be able to choose your venue and when you want to appear on that venue.
I don't want to get sidetracked, but I do want to ask about this question of diligent compromise. That's an interesting turn of phrase. To me, it kind of suggests that you have to give something to get something, that in that compromise, there's something lost.
Yes. Some people call it bartering. Some people call it give and take. Mm-hmm. The blues singers call it, like Joe Tex, you better hold on to what you got until you get what you want. And that's very hard to do, because we live by this ethos in the theater, less is more. But civilians live more is more. Mm-hmm. We are spendthrifts, not only with our money, but with our talent and with our time. Whereas now, part of an individual's success is, and this is a phrase I've just been, I invented really, and I've just been dealing with since I was out in San Diego for a week at the Theater Communications Group conference, breaking the Methuselah Code. Now, we all know that Methuselah is the oldest living person, the oldest living human being. He lived for 969 years. Mm-hmm. Now, I use that as a metaphor for longevity in the theater, because so much of making it in this industry is debilitating, because you must burn the candle from both ends and the middle all the time. At the same time, you want to live forever. You want to perform forever. Time, as invented by man, is linear. Mm-hmm. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. But Methuselah time is time eternal. That's what I mean by breaking the Methuselah Code. Mm-hmm. So we have to find a way to make art for an eternity. This doesn't mean that we don't die, but what it does mean is that the legacy that we live keeps us alive forever. Mm-hmm. But you don't really have important stories to tell when you're 16, when you're 21. When you're 35, mm-hmm. you know, you're falling in love, you're trying to rear a family, or whatever it is that you're busy doing. You don't have stories to tell until you reach middle age. Mm-hmm. And for so long, middle age has been 45, 50, and at 60-year-old. Mm-hmm. It brings to mind the great American playwright Arthur Miller, who wrote Death of a Salesman. And Willie Loman, who is the central character in that play, self-identifies as old and is perceived by his community as old at 60. But 60 now is the new 40, we say. Yes. Again, breaking that Methuselah Code. So you may not have an important narrative coalesced. It isn't coherent. It isn't ready to tell until you're 60. But if you're decrepit and walking with a cane or in a wheelchair or haven't taken care of yourself or dealing with type 2 diabetes or degenerative heart disease or whatever those conditions are that we associate with getting old and that we think that's nature's way, well, no, we have to disabuse ourselves of that. And we have to take care of ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, yes, so that when the convergence of our life experience comes together in a story worthy enough to tell, we have the wherewithal to tell it.
It's so interesting to hear you say this, because you're very busy right now. You're in a very busy professional time right now, and you're not getting any younger. And I think about the physical demands that are placed on a performer like you, much greater than on a musician, much greater than on a musician. You obviously have found ways to stay healthy and to stay physical, and I'm curious a little bit about that. But you also, you know, when you leave a voicemail at the end of an email on your website, you always close by saying namaste.
Yes.
And it suggests to me that at some point you discovered yoga and maybe some deeper Eastern philosophy.
Yes. However, I don't want anyone to think, when I use the term yoga, of mats and a class in a health club. The essence of yoga is understanding that every breath is sacred. If we did nothing but breathe correctly, we could break the Methuselah Code. Of the great literature that exists for us to learn from, regardless of whether you are a creationist or a scientist or an atheist, some of the greatest literature is in what we call the Holy Scriptures. In terms of figures of speech, in terms of meta-language, in terms of peeling that onion and going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and never really getting to the end of a narrative. Mm-hmm. Because the more you are healthily skeptic, the more is revealed to you. Now, I say all of that to say this. The United States of America is considered the greatest country in the world, probably for this important reason: freedom of worship. Not politics, but the freedom to worship the way you want, the way you choose. Nevertheless, there are three major religious disciplines here: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The reason I mention this is because those three major disciplines share the same creation story. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was void and without form, etc. I want to fast forward to the sixth day after light had been spoken into existence and birds were thrown into the air and fishes were thrown into the ocean and animals were thrown into the forest, etc. This is the day before God rests, and he looks at what he has created, and the Creator says, "This is good." And then the Creator says, and this is revolutionary, and every time I consider it, it has a thicker, more layered meaning, and I learn something different from it. Mm-hmm. And then the Creator says, after he looks around at what he created, he says, "I am lonely. I think I'll make me a man." And how does he make a man? Of course, in his image, as we believe. He scoops up, or the Creator, because the Creator may have been she, mm-hmm. The Creator scoops up a handful of dust, a handful of earth, a handful of clay, and blows into it not the breath of politics, right? Not the breath of nationalities, not the breath of sexual orientation, not the breath of any of those artifices. The Creator blows into this handful of base material the breath of life. And that's what it means to be created in his image. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say that what yoga is about is understanding that every breath is sacred, because that is the essence of what animates us as humanity. Mm-hmm. So namaste means, with every breath I take, I recognize in you the divinity that created all that we experience. Mm-hmm.
When did you find that?
Well, I certainly remember it. I don't remember the day, the year, but I certainly remember in 1970, I had come to New York in 73 from Chicago. Didn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of, but I was in New York. It's where I wanted to be. I had to make the best of things. Of course, there was a small group of friends who nurtured me, who allowed me to sleep on a couch here, a couch there, this sort of thing. But once I had sat down some roots. And once I knew that I was going to be involved in The Wiz, which is the Broadway show that garnered my first national attention, I came down with a severe case of strep throat. Now, I'm a man who believes in signs and omens. Strep throat was my nemesis as a child. We were not immunized against anything growing up in the hood. And strep throat would get me every year. So by the time I was about to do The Wiz, 26 years old, I had so much scar tissue on my tonsils and my adenoids that I was a magnet for the streptococcus virus. But here I was about to become The Wiz, and I was sounding like this. I was recommended to an excellent eye, ear, and throat doctor. He looked at my throat, and he shook his head, and he said to me, "We're going to have to remove your tonsils. But if you do exactly what I tell you to do, you're going to be all right, and this path that you're on to this new show will not be interrupted." Long story short, his advice after the surgery and medication and so forth was to not speak and not allow anyone to lure me into speaking for an entire week. And during that week, practice breathing through my nose and exhaling through my mouth and making noise. So I followed his instructions. Lo and behold, when I finally healed and I was in the rehearsal process, what had used to be my top note, a G, with all that scar tissue on my tonsils, was now approaching an A. So I made breathing my number one discipline from that point. And just by that habit, it led me to Eastern disciplines, yogis and Buddhism and asceticism and the nurturing of spirit as opposed to the nurturing of your gut.
I love that you came to it through the breath. The breath is a deceptively simple thing. You know, like when you learn to meditate, they say focus on your breath. That can ground you. It's enough. But I always think of that as a kind of a metaphor. But it's not.
It's not a metaphor. It's literal. It's literal. Absolutely literal. And the nemesis of the breath is the ego. That chattering magpie in your head that tells you, who do you think you are? You can't do this. Meditate? You're going to concentrate on something? You're going to focus on your breath? What about the chores you have to do? What about the money you have to... What about all the things that distract you from aligning those 7 chakras, right? So that now it's getting a little esoteric, but that's what the breath is all about, to awaken that sleeping kundalini, that sleeping cobra in the middle of your back. And once it's awakened and lined, then all of the energy from the universe, which is available to anybody who wants to use it, becomes available. People ask me, Andre, where do you get your energy? I said, from the universe. It's there for anyone to use, but you have to know how to tap into it.
I think that is so much more informative than asking, which we could talk about if you want, what you eat and what you don't eat and what you drink and what you don't drink. Because, I'm sure from a technical point of view, that's all very valuable. But hearing you say, my energy comes from the universe.
Right.
It's a deeper thing, and it gives, to me, more insight into you.
Yeah, and what has more energy than the Big Bang? But I will say this, succinctly. I exercise vigorously. I eat judiciously, and I pray constantly. Doesn't mean I'm on my knees with my hand folding. It's a state of mind. Praying is being generous and expressing gratitude. Those are the ingredients of the fuel that runs the engine of the universe. Generosity and gratitude.
I want to roll back a little bit now. I loved hearing about when you arrived in New York, and that's probably such a rich time to talk about. But I also know from personal experience that you ended up spending some important time in the Midwest.
Oh, yes. Here's the story. Again, it's why we should pay attention to omens and signs. Now, I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. Anyone who knows history understands that Maryland is a southern state. Mm-hmm. It's the first major state below the Mason-Dixon line. And geographically, that's how we decide what is north and what is south. Mm-hmm. The Mason-Dixon line, which is that very straight line, which is the southern border of Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. I mention that because in the Civil War, Maryland was torn asunder, right down the middle, because there were those who sided with the North. They were the Maryland carpetbaggers, and there were those who sided with the South. They were the Maryland rebels. So in Maryland, it was truly a case of brother against brother. Again, when you listen to the song Baltimore, it's in there. I refer to Baltimore as the toe of the North and the head of the South. Mm-hmm. In many ways, I was a child at risk. Not because I was abused by anyone in my family, but because we all had been marginalized to the edges of society. We were living in an impoverished ghetto. You know, it's curious and it's wonderful that I sit across from my Jewish brother and I use so many terms that I borrow from your culture. It's curious that black people live in a ghetto, mm-hmm. and we talk about the African diaspora. I guess that's another conversation.
Yeah.
But
I would only add that I'm borrowing as much, if not more, from the black culture in my daily life.
Right. So marginalized to the edges of society, living in an impoverished, a materially impoverished situation, and getting along as historically black people have on faith that perhaps I'm not getting my rewards in this life, but I will in the next life. Mm-hmm. Well, as the secession of generations continues, the more we believe that we should collect our rewards in this life. Maryland is also historically a settling state for the Society of Friends, the Quakers being one of the early communities of abolitionists. Now, that sets the background for why in 1960, when I'm going to college, a group comes to me called the Central Scholarship Bureau, because I had been part of the Junior League. Do you know anything about the Junior League?
Predates me, yeah.
Yes,
I've heard about it. But
the Junior League was an organization of corporate white businessmen who were progressive in their thinking and thought, as many liberal-minded people do today, that we could help elevate Negroes if we expose them to a conduit into the world of business, moneymakers. So through this Junior Achievement League, an individual, a CEO from some company, would come to the school and oversee an after-school program. These two organizations, the Junior Achievement League and the Central Scholarship Bureau, are the people who defined me as a child at risk, because I had smarts, but I was more or less a piece of fruit overripening on the vine, right? And I was going to spoil. So the Central Scholarship Bureau says to me, as I'm about to graduate from high school, how would you like to go to college? Oh, yeah, I would.
Had you been thinking about that?
Of course, but I didn't know how I was going to do it. And, of course, through all of this, my dreams to become a performer, my dreams to go to college were, I won't say disdained by my family and my peers and my neighbors, but they certainly thought, you better get a firmer hold on reality and find something to do that earn you some money and forget this pipe dream. But pipe dreams is what successes are made of. So the Central Scholarship Bureau says, we will give you a scholarship and we will arrange a work-study program for you, because the Quakers believe, pray with your feet, which means work while you're asking for grace. We'll give you a scholarship. not to give you, we'll arrange a scholarship for you, and we will arrange a work-study program for you. You must attend the college of our choice, however. And that was a Quaker school called Wilmington College in Wilmington, Ohio, southeastern Ohio. So that's where I went for my first 3 years, to Wilmington, Ohio, which was a pristine campus, beautiful, but totally pristine. And I will just use one description and I'll let you know what the experience was like. There were 1,000 students on campus, 1,000 students on campus, 35 of whom were black. 25 of the black students were from Africa.
Oh, so that's 15 African American,
exactly.
Black American
and we weren't African Americans then.
Yeah.
And the Africans did not consider us black. They considered us Negroes.
Wow.
Exactly. Wow. That was my freshman year. And then my sophomore year. But the sophomore year was one of great liberation because it was the legitimization of the dream that I had been carrying close to my vest. See, here's the one thing that I would like to share with anybody who can take away from this conversation, this nugget. It isn't enough to dream of a goal. Once you have a goal, then you must have an epiphany that shows you a path to achieving the goal. And then after the epiphany, you must have an event that legitimizes the epiphany that showed you the path to achieving the goal about which you've been dreaming. It wasn't until I got to my sophomore year in college that a teacher who is still in my life, who comes to see all the work that I do, his name is I'll give him a shout out. His name is James Marty Gilbert, who said to me, I've always wanted to do Raisin in the Sun on this campus, but there's never been the right talent. How would you like to play Walter Lee Younger? And I'm thinking, how would I like to play Walter Lee Younger? Yeah, that's all I've been dreaming about. Not dreaming about playing Walter Lee Younger, but having a way to make a material manifestation of these deferred dreams that I've been carrying around.
Were you interested in theater at that point, or were you still
all
thinking
my
about...
life? All my life I was interested in theater, but that's what people were trying to dissuade me against. Because I will say today, after 45 years of making my way in the theater, that a life in the theater only guarantees two things, and it's not fame and fortune. It's rejection and insecurity. And for those of you who are listening and who are dreaming of theater as a way to life, check this out. If when you get hungry, and you most assuredly will get hungry in your pursuit of a career, if you can make a meal of rejection, and when you get lonely, and you will certainly get lonely in your pursuit of a career, if you can make a companion of insecurity, then this is the industry for you. But if the thought of eating rejection and loving insecurity frightens you in the least bit, find something else to do and leave it to those of us who know how to live perched capriciously on the precipice of the abyss. So, sophomore year in college, the teacher says to me, "You want to play Walter Lee Younger?" Yeah. That legitimizes the epiphany that I had about the dream of becoming an entertainer. And what makes it legitimate? My family gets on a bus and come to Wilmington, Ohio, and witness my performing Walter Lee Younger in this college production. But then they have their own epiphany. Wow, he's serious, and he really can do what he says he can do. This is no longer a dream. This is now becoming a reality. It's incomplete at the time because I'm a student in college. Mm-hmm. But maybe he's on to something. Then my junior year abroad, and when I was going to college, at the same time that your dad was going to college, it was de rigueur to do your junior year in Europe. You know, we were all watching Francois Truffaut films, and everybody had to go to school somewhere in Europe. Being a young black man and being influenced really, and I wasn't articulating this then the way I can now, but really being influenced by the vectors of social welfare. And this comes from the 20s and the 30s, when the Harlem Renaissance was just converging around black letters.
And were these ideas that you were made aware of growing up?
Oh, yeah, because my parents were disciples, if you will, of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who had created this concept of the new Negro. This was the second Reconstruction, if you will. A Communist Party, before it was a dirty word, was creating things like the AFL-CIO and world labor movements, and an alternative to capitalism, which was leeching not only the wealth, but the spiritual strength from the people who worked and built this nation with their blood, sweat, and tears.
Yes, and this leads you to study abroad in...
Right. Denmark, which at the time was the example, was the herald of social welfare. All of Scandinavia. But Denmark was the jewel of the crown. So that's where I went.
So you went from being a very small minority in a small college, one of 15 black American men, to Denmark.
To Denmark.
Where you had to stand
where
out.
I was the solitary black man. Now, understand, this is 1966, 67. Now, if I go to Denmark, they say, oh, not another one, you know. But this is 1966, 67. It's where Sonny Stitt went when he couldn't make a living here in the United States. You know, Josephine Baker went to Paris, etc. Sonny Stitt I met him in Denmark as a junior. And the Danes literally were saying things like, may I touch your hair? May I touch your skin? So this was like the reverse of the discrimination that I was experiencing in the United States of America. I was a king. Now, it's 66, 67. I'm in Europe. I'm in Denmark. I'm looking back at the United States of America. And what's happening back here? Our inner cities, we now call it urban insurrection, but our inner cities were going up in flame. Riots were happening all over the place.
And you're reading about this
And I'm
abroad.
reading about it in Denmark, where things were I was chilling silly, you know what I mean? And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, can I go back to Wilmington College, this pristine Quaker institution, notwithstanding the debt I owed to the Quakers? Long story short, I applied to bigger institutions because what was happening at the time was Berkeley, Ann Arbor, Columbia, and the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Similarly, they offered me part scholarship, part work-study program. And it was an oracle speaking to me. Go there. And that's where I went. To finish my senior year. See, people who know me from Madison think I was there for 4 years. I was there for 18 months.
So what was it about Madison, the right place at the right time, the right moment for you?
The right place at the right time, the right people at the right... Again, and you know this, Madison was the hotbed of political foment. And the political foment was provoked by the Jewish constituency from New York. America was having its veil of innocence ripped from its eyes. The Vietnam War, Nixon, Watergate, the war on poverty, etc. It's where I needed to be. It's where many of my lifelong relationships were established. It's where I came of age. It's where I experienced the summer of love. It's where I authentically grasped my sexual orientation. It's where so much of the pieces of the puzzles that were disconnected at the time fell into place, and I could mature minus the trauma.
You know, you talk about if you're prepared to make a meal out of rejection and a bed made out of solitude, then this is for you.
Right, exactly.
Hell of a job description.
Yeah, but you know, What is the credo of the University of Wisconsin?
Sifting and winnowing.
Sifting and winnowing, separating the wheat from the chaff.
Yes.
And that's when you say to someone, here's the job description, the boys leave the room immediately and the men remain.
But by the time you came face to face with the reality of rejection and loneliness, you had spent 3 years or 2 years and before that, I mean, your whole life.
My whole life,
You're dealing with the question of how do I...
Just to finish your statement.
Yeah.
When I came face to face with rejection and insecurity, I had a degree in it. I had a PhD in it. I just didn't have the diploma, I had the experience, but I didn't have the red badge of courage. That's what I got at the University of Wisconsin.
Do you think that these are things that can be taught?
No, you have to learn it. You have to be in the trenches. You have to be on the front line. Now, you can sit and mentor. You can wax poetic about it. You can offer guidance. You can red flag the obstacles, the pitfalls, the potholes. But the individual has to start out on the path, him or herself, and learn it firsthand. Mm-hmm. And then you know it. However, we mustn't be glib about learning. One of the reasons why I can speak confidently about where I've been, where I am, and where I'm headed is because of my 10 siblings. There were so many examples before me to look at and say to myself, okay, he did A and received B. If I don't want B, don't do A. Figure out another equation. Do X and get Y, or whatever, however you mix it up for yourself. The idea is that learn from other people's mistakes. You can't live long enough to make them all yourself, even if you break the Methuselah Code.
Which we're working on.
Yes, which we are working on. And evidence of it is the New York Times from Wednesday, because the people who have come to me and just gone, Andre, wow, speak tomes and tomes of what they're thinking.
It's funny. I hope that you don't take this in the wrong way, but I did not bat an eye when I saw that photo. I didn't think twice about it. I just thought, well, of course. I mean, I didn't even know about the event, but when I read about it, I thought, of course they showed your picture. Of course they led the story with you.
But you've been acquainted with me, mm-hmm. perhaps the least, but you know me the most of those folks. Because our relationship is about coming together, falling in love quickly, doing the work, and divorcing as quickly as we fell in love. Fall in love quickly,
yes.
Get the work done, divorce quickly.
Yes.
A friend of mine from Japan came to see me in something I was doing at the Classical Theater of Harlem, and she hung out afterwards at the party following, so forth. And she says, "Oh, this is so exciting. Why is everybody called baby?" And it's like, well, that's because we dispense with names. Because names aren't important. We're not going to be together that long. So everyone is baby or darling. "Oh, darling. Oh, baby. Oh, honey, how are you? Love to see you. Bye. Call me." That's not knowing someone, even if you work together.
Well, we've said, you and I have, I think one of the benefits that I had in working with you is that I really was not aware of how the rest of the world may have seen you, or what your reputation or status may have been, or any of that. And so I was able to walk into a room with you cold, person to person. Maybe that's part of, it's when people see you in the paper for this event, it's a big deal and it resonates
across the universe,
yes.
like the Beatles say. But that's what we live for.
Yeah.
Just one ripple that vibrates across the universe.
Let's talk briefly about, after Wisconsin, you stayed in the Midwest and moved to Chicago. Is that true? Or
No, that is true, because, again, I just want to go back to the equation briefly. The dream, the epiphany, the event that legitimizes the whole thing. Mm-hmm. That golden triangle. And when I teach my classes, that's what I use, that symbol of a golden triangle. And what that is in your life is a convergence of your mind, your body, and your spirit. Mm-hmm. If one of those elements is missing, you're not working at full throttle. When I graduated from the University of Wisconsin, the month I graduated, I got my first professional gig in Chicago, which was Hair, with Tom O'Horgan at the Shubert Theater. Mm-hmm. Now, I can be glib and say the rest is history. It is. But it was in Chicago that the cornucopia, if you will, began to release its abundance. Because since then, and I'm not saying it's been easy, it is not easy. And it never will be easy. As a matter of fact, when you pass each test, it gets harder because you've passed the test. Your mettle is tested at every turn. And as a Capricorn, I subscribe to this motto: the top of one mountain is the bottom of the next. Keep climbing. It is not easy. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, however, when you put on the blinders and you recognize your path and you commit to that path, then every step you take is golden. And I discovered my vein of gold in Chicago after graduating from the University of Wisconsin.
Did you discover it in terms of the path before you being clear, like you just knew the steps that you wanted to take, or did you discover that there was something inside of you that was golden?
It's all interior work. That's what makes it golden, because outside of you are all the distractions. If you have gone deep, you see, the abyss I'm talking about is inside. That's the abyss. When you arrive at the abyss, there's only one thing to do: jump. Jump into the abyss. Because only one of two things can happen. Either you'll sprout wings and you'll soar, or the safety net will appear. There's no such thing as a bottomless pit. I would even go so far as to say there's no such thing as failure. But it's hard to remove that term from our active vocabulary because we are so addicted to it.
Mm-hmm. Although, in one sense, the rest is history, are there specific moments after that first show in Chicago when you felt like you came up to the edge of the abyss?
Every day, before I leave my little flat in Manhattan, before I open that door, I take the deepest breath of the morning, and then I step outside. Because the moment I'm on the other side of the door, and I'm speaking metaphorically again, Satan is right in my face. How'd you like a little of this? How'd you like a little of that? Isn't this really what you want? How come you're going down that path? It's so narrow. Why don't you try this one? It's broad. It's all this. But I remember the lessons I learned early in life. Not all that glitters is gold. Or as my mother would say, not every goodbye is gone. Not every shut eye is asleep. So in terms of this metaphor I use about when in Chicago, that's when the cornucopia released its abundance. Mm-hmm. That's because there are a few universal truths. One of them, or the cardinal truth, is the universe always says yes. There is no exception to that rule. Now people say, what are you talking about? I've had bad times,
Sure.
I've had negative vibes in my life and so forth. I said, yeah, I understand that. But here's the trick. If you are bent on a path of self-destruction, the universe will give you every tool you need to destroy yourself. It's saying yes to what you are asking for, wishing for, preparing for, expecting to happen. On the other hand, if you're on a path of redemption, the universe will give you every tool to assist you along your path of redemption. But it's never going to say, no, don't do that. It's going to say, yeah, go ahead, do that. Mm-hmm. And here's all you need to achieve it.
Yes.
Which is why that moment you wake up and you realize, oh, I got it. Mm-hmm. The universe is made for my pleasure, right? It's not a burden. It's made for my pleasure. So why don't I agree with it? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because once you agree with the universe, it conspires to help you.
Which is a beautiful way of setting the stage for your arrival in New York. And I know it wasn't easy, but you did arrive in New York and in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, and then after arriving here, January of 1973, in August of 1974, I was rehearsing for The Wiz.
That role is a defining role for your career.
Yes.
It happened young and early in your career.
Yes.
What was the environment around that whole experience like?
It was a threshold in the continuum that we call the Great White Way. Previous to The Wiz, there had been rare examples of what we now call inclusion, ethnic diversity, non-traditional casting, multiculturalism on the Great White Way. But there hadn't been a serious enough puncture in the balloon to deflate the idea that this was exclusive territory. Then along comes The Wiz, that had the audacity to take one of the sacrosanct chestnuts, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland, the goddess, and not defile it, no, not commit any blasphemy or apostasy, but simply borrow the story of a little prepubescent girl who learns one of those other universal truths, that there's no place like home, and set it in an ethnic situation that doesn't dispute or deny the precedent, but simply opens the door and leaves it open for all other little girls. And that was the defining moment for The Wiz, when everybody, through the eyes of a little girl, went, this is about me. And that changed Broadway, truly changed Broadway, which is why I continue, I don't do it frequently, but when I have the opportunity, I pull that 40-year-old Wiz suit out of my closet and put it on and remind people, first of all, that I am breaking the Methuselah Code, and secondly, that we have yet to give the appropriate service to The Wiz that it deserves. It needs to be treated as a classic because it changed the politics of Broadway forever.
Do you feel that that role opened up a certain kind of category or type of work that was either interesting to you or that people expected of you or wanted from you? Or
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, because that role and my approach to inhabiting that character opened up an opportunity for me to create an archetype that had not existed on Broadway before. Now, the archetype for white performers existed, but the archetype of regal manliness for black men had not existed on Broadway before that. And I proudly take credit, partly, for establishing that archetype. And as I said earlier, I wasn't so covetous of it that I shut the door. I left the door open for the other folks who were having a similar dream and who needed an epiphany. Whether or not it gets legitimized is on them. But you got the dream, here's the epiphany. Now what you going to do with it? And lo and behold, any number of young black people have had an opportunity to be the Wiz. But I had to be careful not to be the Wiz for the rest of my life. That isn't why I'm in the game. Okay, here's the Wiz, y'all. I'm moving on to the Viper and Ain't Misbehaving. Here's the Viper, y'all. I'm moving on to the big black man in the Full Monty. Here's the big black man, y'all. I'm moving on and on and on. I'm breaking the Methuselah Code. It is no longer a finite dream of theater as a way of life. It's now an infinite authentic narrative, theater as a way to life.
Did you have a sense, you personally and the whole cast, the development of The Wiz, that it was a new archetype, that you had this responsibility?
Yes, and it is such a conundrum, because we knew we were setting a precedent by the strength of the resistance we were receiving.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew we're onto something here. Let's not give up. We were not treated kindly by the critics. And one of the most distressing experiences one can have in the theater world is to have on opening night your closing notice posted. That's part of the protocol in the industry, because nobody wants a percentage of nothing. And if your show closes, you ain't got nothing. But everybody wants a percentage of something. So in order for the worker, and in this situation, the actor is the laborer, the producer has to put in escrow with our union, an Actors Equity Association, although it's called an association, is a labor union, a member of the AFL-CIO. The producer has to put in escrow 2 weeks' salary for every performer in the show, in case he's caught with his knickers down, as some producers are. We are not caught in an embarrassing situation. The money is in the escrow. If you have to close your show, close your show. But we'll go to our union and we'll collect 2 weeks' salary.
Mm-hmm.
So we had been treated so unkindly that when we opened on January 5th, 1975, we didn't have any advance. So the producer, doing the wise and correct thing,
Posted the notice?
Posted the notice. In 2 weeks, you don't have a gig. And we were like, but we're opening. Well, yeah, I know. But the producer, this is Ken Harper, who's no longer with us, and who is remembered as one of the first producers to use live-action commercials in television,
mm-hmm.
whereas before it was just images with captions
mm-hmm.
or maybe a voiceover. The producer, some of this is good. I mean, this is the upside, and there's a downside. The producer sold his rights to the Broadway show to Hollywood to get the money to make a live-action commercial. Now, what does that do? That reaches through the television, into your home where you're sitting in your underwear on the couch eating pretzels and drinking beer and saying, get out, put on some clothes, come to the theater, come to Broadway. This is about you. And that's what Black America did. Finally, they said, I'm on Broadway?
Yeah.
This place that had always been inhospitable to me. So Black America came out, put some clothes on, spent some money, and it was one of those few instances where the vox populi, mm-hmm. the voice of the people, overruled the voice of the critics.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is still the most powerful promotional tool. Someone going to the theater, having the experience, coming out and saying to you, you have got to see this show.
Yes. Did he advertise nationally? Was it national advertising?
Well, it was a national commercial because we'd done the national pre-Broadway tour.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we were limping into New York, because people were saying, oh, well, why do we need
mm-hmm.
a colored version of the Judy Garland
mm-hmm.
brilliance, as it were? You know, we did our 2 weeks of previews. We were going to do our 2 weeks after opening, and then we were all going to shake hands, divorce, and go home.
Mm-hmm. You know, you telling the story, explaining how the union protects you as an actor, referring to the actors as the labor force, which they are, makes a connection for me that I hadn't really understood in you, which is the importance of unions. I know you're very active in the union. When I hear you talk about the fact that the union protects the labor in situations like a show closing on opening day, and more to the point, when I hear you talking about the importance of the Communist Party, the socialist idea, the people from the Junior League who helped to elevate potentially lost souls, and it kind of illuminates your relationship and your respect for unions in a new way.
Absolutely. Now, you've made that connection. I was going to say, this goes back to why I studied in Denmark. Mm-hmm. It was a totally naive intuition. But it was the oracle. Mm-hmm. just pushing me in the right direction.
Well, if you hadn't been to Denmark, you might not have been able to see the United States with that.
No, that's exactly it. If I had not gone to Denmark, I would not have had this Hubble telescopic version of the United States of America. Because while I was immersed in it, I couldn't see my place in it. Mm-hmm. It's just as when the ancients thought the earth was the center of the universe. And then Galileo and Copernicus excommunicated from the Catholic Church because they said, wait a minute, we're not the center of the universe.
I mean, I think it's wonderful and not surprising that in the length of this conversation and depth of this conversation, we have barely scratched the surface of your lengthy career. But I'm so pleased with how this is going down.
I'm also pleased the phrase, and the rest is history, is not impetuous. Because if you want to know that, just go to Google or, YouTube, or read my resume.
Yes.
And you can see all that information. The rest is history, is information. This active conversation is knowledge.
I saw you, when I think I was in high school, come to Madison and act in a performance at the Union Theater. I think it was The Man
Who Came to Dinner.
Now that, I remember, that's my memory of you, my first memory of you. I didn't have any sense of context, what I was seeing, what I wasn't seeing, what the expectation might have been for somebody who was more informed when they went to see a show. But I got the sense as I was watching it that it was another pretty radical twist on an expectation, that you played a role that maybe would not have been expected for you to play.
Exactly. And although I am proud of the work that we did, it was much more of a political statement for me than it was of an artistic statement. That was a time in the arc of my career when I was deliberately and voluntarily being the poster boy for non-traditional casting, because I had been challenged on a daily basis by the unwritten law that you cannot play this role because of the color of your skin. Of course, the intelligent argument against that is when in a play or a musical, ethnicity or race is not germane to the character, then the role should go to the best qualified. Mm-hmm. That's the democratic approach. Playwright has the deciding vote, if you will. But those playwrights are dead, so you can't consult them. And they didn't leave in any will or any estate codicil that black men cannot play. Whiteside is his name. His last name is Whiteside. But it's Sheridan Whiteside. Yeah. So it's up to and it's curious that you have to say bravery, but it's up to the bravery of the director. It's up to his sensibilities. It's up to how he wants to level the playing field.
But once the playing field is leveled, I mean...
It has to be leveled again and again.
It has to be leveled again and again, or it's a political statement every time.
It is a political statement every time, because the playing field has to be leveled repeatedly, yes, because there are still bastions of exclusivity in the art world. Mm-hmm. Because the creator of the art is his muse, his inspiration is internal, is interior. And the artist wants to see that externalized. And when it doesn't come out the way it lives inside him or her, it's a political battle.
It sort of raises the question, well, who does it belong to?
Well, the answer to that is it belongs to everybody, which is why the Vox Populi has to win. Mm-hmm. Because as practitioners of democracy, we are beholden to doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And the greatest good for the greatest number of people is theater's for everybody.
Yeah.
It's for everybody.
Is there value within the world of theater and the arts for work material that is not as easy to come to? You know, I mean, theater is for everybody, yes, but some things are harder to digest than others or are more difficult to process.
If there were a set of bylaws for the theater, one of them would be you must challenge not only the practitioners, but you must challenge the spectators who come to the theater. Mm-hmm. And the covenant that we make is exactly that. We will challenge you, but we will not harm you. That's the agreement. Because there are only two places, there are only two venues where strangers come together and sit in darkness for purposes of communication, communion, and worship. One is the temple/church. The other cathedral is the theater. And in both situations, although audiences won't articulate it this way, but in both situations, we come to have questions answered. We come to have problems solved, crises resolved, burdens lifted, yokes broken. That's why we go to the theater. That's why we go to the church. Curiously enough, both of those institutions are now more about mere diversion than the actual wrestling with philosophical problems.
Or existential problems.
Or existential problems, yeah. But that's okay, because as long as you come, it lets us know that we can build whatever it is that we want, make it as challenging as we want. It's going to be a magnet for some demographic.
As we're talking, there's a part of me that's thinking, and I guess this is part of what I was thinking before you arrived today, that there's this kind of, it's not a contradiction, but you're able to take something that might be considered not lowbrow, but from the street and elevate it. And at the same time, take something that might be seen as highbrow and bring it back down to the ground. And I think that that's where you really live.
You have, as we say, hit the proverbial nail on the head. We as artists we're modern inventions. And we need to reconnect with our ancient counterparts, which is alchemist. Now, I go back to the illustration I used before. The creator is the archetypal alchemist. Why? Because the creator took something base and turned it into something divine. That is what we do as minor creators, as artists. We take the common and transform it into the uncommon. We take the ordinary and turn it into the extraordinary. We take the pedestrian and turn it into the exceptional. We take the mundane and turn it into something as close to the divine as we remember. That ancient mass amnesia that infects us at the moment of birth, when we begin to forget all the knowledge we had in the womb. When I was earning my MA from New York University, one of my professors, John Carroll, said to his class, I teach from the point of view of innatism. And as a good student, I took a note, went home, picked up the dictionary to get the definition of innatism. Couldn't find it. Went back to Professor Carroll, and he says, oh, no, that's a word that I coined. And this is what it means. And I have made it part of my active vocabulary. Innatism. We know everything we need to know. We simply do not know that we know it. And that is what our life experience is. Trying to remember what we are forgetting. Trying to remember what we know.
Andre, thank you for helping me to remember what we both know and for telling me a little bit about what you know.
This has been a moment of tremendous joy for me. Thank you.
Whoa.